Welcome to Elevate Louisiana's Engage Videocast. Elevate Louisiana was founded in 2020 to empower women leaders throughout Louisiana by connecting and educating them on the challenges impacting our state with data-driven, nonpartisan solutions to make a better future for Louisiana. Hello, I'm your host, Julie Stokes. Today we are recording the second episode in a series on the Louisiana budget. Our guests joining us today are Greg Albrecht and Chris Keaton. Greg has been the chief economist of the Louisiana Legislative Fiscal Office since 1991. In this role, he is responsible for forecasting the state's major tax revenues, estimating the fiscal impact of tax legislation, as well as providing general economic, tax, and fiscal analysis to the legislature. Chris Keaton has worked in state government for 29 years and was recently elected to be the Legislative Fiscal Officer. He previously worked for House Fiscal Division for 16 years, where I worked with him on a constant basis, as the office's deputy director and as a budget analyst for several areas of state government, including the Department of Health. Chris served for 2 years as the undersecretary for the Department of Public Safety, where he provided management oversight of the operations of the department. Welcome, Greg, and welcome, Chris.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Glad to be here.
Very good to have you here. We wanted to do this particular session because the Legislative Fiscal Office provides most of the information that the legislature relies upon in making its decisions, both in planning for the session, when they determine what the overall budget limits are to be in balance with the revenues that are coming in. And that's kind of what Greg will talk about. He'll talk about the revenues that are anticipated in the process to determine that. And then Chris will talk about how they take those numbers from revenue and figure out how much government spending can occur in order to have a balanced budget. So we'll start first with looking at the revenue side. Yesterday, we're recording this on January, gosh, what is it now, the 20th? And yesterday was the Revenue Estimating Committee. And if you saw that, you might have seen Greg giving a similar presentation yesterday. So I'm just going to turn it over to Greg right now and let him go ahead and go through a small slideshow, and we can talk a little bit about the impact COVID's had on our economy and therefore our revenue picture and where we can expect to go from here.
All right.
So, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Julie. Start off here with the first slide here that just sort of summarizes the overall employment situation in the state. The top green line is total payroll employment. These are W-2 payroll employed jobs, establishment surveyed. This does not include 1099 and gig workers. This is the traditional payroll employment concept that's tracked. The bottom line, the blue line, is the private sector out of the total. The difference would be the government sector, state, local, and federal combined. I started here with January 20 because that's 2020 year I'm going to call January and February pre-COVID. If I went back for several more months, I'd still have almost essentially a flat line. So easy to start there. You see the fall off started a little bit in March and then really dropped down in April. And that was the sort of the trough point. And in those 2 months, we lost 273,000 total payroll jobs. We lost more employment than that because we lost a lot of independent contractor work. But the traditional tracking showed 273,000 jobs. Since then, in the following 7 months through November, the data for December employment in the state won't be released until the end of this month, January, next week or week after next. And we've added back 175,000 jobs of the 273. It's not the exact jobs, but we lost 273. We've had an a net add back of 175,000. The first few months, couple months were pretty good, and then it starts to get a little bit slower. I wanted to kind of put out there projections of the employment numbers going forward at the end of each of these quarters, or months at the end of each quarter, going all the way out through fiscal year 22 for us, which fiscal years go from July to June, just to show that the baseline forecasts here don't even get us back to pre-COVID levels at 2 years out, June of 22nd. still 60 plus thousand short on total employment. You have to go out to late 2023, early 2024 to get to a projection that is at the pre-COVID levels, much less, beyond it. Now these are projections, they'll be revised. Those little dots will change their levels a little bit, but they're not likely to dramatically change their levels. And of course, when you start going out multiple years, all projections have to be taken with, larger and larger grains of salt. But this is what we're kind of looking at as the outlook for employment. The easy job gains have probably, add backs have been done, and it gets tougher and tougher to do that. And that's kind of got me worried about how long it'll take the state fisc to recover, is just looking at this, because the state fisc extracts its revenue from the underlying economy. And this is a major metric of the underlying economy, total and private sector job counts.
So great. Great.
Sorry?
As you transition to the next slide, just how similar is this to every other state? I mean, are we kind of
very similar?
Yeah,
very similar. Everybody's kind of got the same picture right now. The question mark in everybody's mind is really, what's the slope of those green dots and blue dots going out there? Yeah. But everybody's pretty much, this happened just nationwide extremely rapidly, and the quick fall off, and then the recovery. And then we've had, every state's gone through its different waves and phases of public policy lockdown, as well as private sector individual fear. Much of staying out of businesses isn't about lockdowns. It's about fear. People just aren't going, whether they're allowed to or not. And every state's kind of had the same experience here, and kind of looks the same. And then of course we're all hoping that the lines going out will be steeper, and we'll get back to pre-COVID earlier or quicker. Yeah. This is kind of the outlook at this moment. Yeah. The next picture here is a bunch of numbers, but what these numbers describe is, I'm going to bounce back to the first one, the fall off March and April, those rows that show the negative drops in red lines. That's just putting the numbers to the drop from pre-COVID to the April trough month. And then the row below it, where I say add back May through November, that's the total amount of add back, the percentage of the fall of the drop that was added back, and how short we still are. That add back row is basically the climb out from April, and each dot going out from April through November actual. And then I've just calculated, well, what percentage of the loss of the add back is the loss? The base is 273,000 for total employment. For mining, it's 4,900. Construction, 20,000. Those are the losses. And then we have added back from that. And you can kind of see across here that in most of the sectors, major industry classifications, we have added back from the loss. It's been almost across the board, but not entirely. And there are somewhat kind of anomalies, I'm going to call them right now. For example, if you just go all the way to the far right of the top set of topic to the retail columns, I've circled it. According to the monthly survey data, as of November, we've actually added back more jobs in retail than we lost in retail. Now, I'm reluctant to believe that. And I know that there'll be significant revisions always happen. The revision process occurs in the late winter, early spring, sometime in February and or March. We will find out what 2020 and 2019 really were like. Most of the revisions are going to occur in the immediate prior calendar year, which is 2020. I don't expect these numbers to be the same. I find that hard to believe, but yeah, that's what the current data shows us.
So, when you say that retail has recovered potentially by these numbers to a greater degree than it was pre-COVID,
right?
Is it where are all these delivery drivers? Are they all in retail? Like if they
depending on the establishment, they would be in the transportation, warehousing, utility sector. The FedEx people and Amazon people pretty much are going to be there.
And they're down.
If a store actually has a delivery guy that, delivers from the store directly, they're probably going to be on the establishment payroll of the retail establishment. But I think what most people think of in terms of delivery is the UPS truck, the FedEx truck, the Amazon truck. Those are all in that column called TRPS, where transportation utilities.
Yeah.
That's where they are.
You-
I just pointed out these three. That is the most unusual one because it shows an actual add back beyond what we lost. And in a sector you wouldn't expect to have more than 100% of the loss added back in yet. But the other three that are a little more worrisome is that there's three sectors that appear to be continuing to lose even beyond the 2-month drop off to March and April, the COVID fall off. And the one most worrisome to me is mining sector, right there in the middle of the top set of rows there, where according to this data, mining lost 4,900 jobs in 2 months. They lost 13% of their pre-COVID level and have continued to lose. In the add back period of May through November, they've lost another 2,300 jobs for a total of 7,200. I mean, they're still short that, I mean, even more than they lost. Mining is a little worrisome. Again, I know all these numbers will get revised. Most revisions to Louisiana data actually go down. These numbers could get worse. And mining is important because it is the highest paid average wage. It's the highest average wage sector in the state's economy. So,
Greg, I remember that when COVID struck, that at the very same time, there had been a bit of an oil crash. Is that
right.
what's happening here?
Yeah, well, oil started weakening in very late 2019 and early 2020, and then it crashed down to extremely low levels before coming back. And what's happened is the demand for energy around the world has fallen off and has not gotten back to its pre-COVID levels. And so energy producers, in this case, states in the mining sector, and mining for Louisiana, of course, is oil and gas extraction almost entirely. And so there's been demand destruction. Even as that demand comes back, the mining is particularly worrisome to me. It's not only an immediate problem because it's very high paid, and it's affiliated with lots of other sectors that supply it, fabricated metals and parts, and they're kept busy by the mining sector. This is very likely going to end up being a permanently smaller employment. Historically, whenever there's a crash in the mining sector, you lose several thousand jobs, you never get them all back. And it drops to a new plateau and a new plateau and a new plateau. And it was at a plateau at roughly 37,000 jobs month after month after month. That's where it settled after the oil prices fell off in late 2014 and 2015. We went into a little state mini recession of our own and didn't even start recovering until late 2016. And mining went from 45,000 to 35 to 40,000, permanently down. And now we get hit with COVID, and it looks like we're going to lose another 5 to 10,000, somewhere in there. We're going to be an even smaller mining sector. So when it comes back and demand comes back online to pre-COVID levels and continues to grow, we will produce oil here with fewer workers. It will be permanently smaller, is what it's historically done. They figure out ways to just keep doing what they're doing to return with fewer people. And Louisiana does not have an horizontal oil production, which is the big industry model around the rest of the country. We have horizontal gas, natural gas, but almost no horizontal oil production goes on in the state. So oil demand rises, our vertical wells will produce, but we don't have a horizontal sector to turn back on rapidly like will happen in Texas and some other states. So we will very likely be permanently smaller, and this is the highest paid sector, and it's going to be permanently smaller. It's worrisome to me. And then a couple other sectors, the management of companies, the sort of catch-all collection of commercial companies, they've actually lost 400 in the fall off, and they've lost another 600 since the fall off. So it's a small number, but we still have a sector that's gotten smaller, and then government has gotten a little smaller as well. Much of that has been in the local government side, not in the state. The federal side would reflect a lot of census workers that were temporarily brought on and then are going to be dismissed. We're going to be dismissed anyway. And then the state government is not downsized dramatically. I put that column over there to the side, but most of the additional loss has been in local governments. So anyway, this breaks down by lots of numbers, but let's get a little bit more specific here to what's important to us. Leisure and hospitality. If you look at the leisure and hospitality, middle column, bottom of the table, 243,000 jobs. We lost 112,000, 46%. We have, according to this data, added back 74% of them. We're still 29,000 or so jobs short of pre-COVID, but that's a surprisingly rapid add back for an area that has bars, restaurants, hotels, entertainment, music venues, et cetera, are in there. I'm skeptical of that add back number as well, but it is what the survey data is suggesting at this point. Health and social, we've added back 50%. Education services, we've added back 50%. This is private education. Public school teachers are in the government sector here. Personal services, all kinds of individual haircuts to salons to tanning parlors, et cetera. They've added back 58%. So we've got some sectors that are still far short of what they lost. I've got another slide that kind of takes that percentage add back from COVID and summarizes it in one picture here, so you can kind of very quickly see most of the sectors have added back 50+% of what they lost. The retail sector, according to the data, says they've added back 110%. And then management of companies has lost 150% of what it's lost an additional 150%. Not a large number, but a surprisingly large effect to them. And then, of course, mining. The one that's really scary is that mining has continued to lose jobs even after we have started we're 7 months of climb out from the trough, and we're still losing jobs in the mining sector.
Based upon my experience in life, I'm shocked that the transportation warehouse, that isn't up.
Up more, you say?
Well, the transportation, I know because you can't, it's not as easy to go shopping,
right.
And there's so much more of that going on. And
yeah, I agree. I see tons of Amazon trucks in my own neighborhood, never used to see.
Right.
But again, the survey data is what it is.
Right.
In revisions, some may go up, but overall, we do tend to go down on the revision. The levels do. These percentage changes are going to depend on what all those other changes are. But just a way to kind of summarize at least one of the important rows in that previous slide, without being cluttered with all kinds of numbers. Here, I do look at initial unemployment claims. I was looking at continuing claims for a good while, but those numbers have fallen off dramatically because people have expired their traditional benefits from the state. You can't necessarily say they got rehired. So I've gone back to looking at initial claims. The blue portion of each column is the traditional regular state unemployment compensation claims that have always been tracked and been a typical measure of the economy. A rising columns means more firing, falling means less firing. The orange portion of each column is what are called pandemic unemployment assistance. That's the additional federal aid that was additional federal eligibility, where we extended unemployment comp to 1099 workers that were never typically eligible for unemployment comp. You need to be a W-2 worker in an establishment. So we got those counts now, so I put them in here, but those are going to eventually run out. It's not likely we're going to permanently change the unemployment systems in the country to always be including these folks. But the numbers are there, so it kind of gives you a little idea of total initial claims for total employment as opposed to just traditional eligibles. What's important here is obviously the numbers have fallen off dramatically from the COVID event in the early weeks of it. You get down to the last few weeks before those last two. There's 4 weeks in there from the week ending December 5th through the week ending December 26th. We got down to about pretty steady 8,000 a week of traditional unemployment claims, much lower than earlier, but still a little worrisome because that level is as low as it is relative to the pandemic period or the serious period, 4 times what was pre-pandemic norm. And I circled that over on the far left, the 2 weeks. And if you went back from weeks before that, they all look like that. We were doing roughly 2,000 a week for many, many months. And then now we're still doing 4 times that. And then these last 2 weeks, when I saw the first one, I thought, well, a 1 week aberration, maybe because after Christmas people held off and then they all went into the unemployment shop after that. And then we get a second week like that. So I'm getting worried that these couple of weeks might be harbingers of something, of another slowdown, up to 20,000 a week. So just something, it's got me worried about the outlook going. How strong will the outlook going forward be? I think there are reasons to be a little worried about it. And these are a couple of little metrics.
And, just to kind of talk about, like, Greg's perspective is that his responsibility is to estimate the revenue so that when the budget is set, it can be set at a balanced budget. So when he worries about whether or not we'll be able to keep up the levels of revenue, he looks at the levels of unemployment and then gets concerned, because I imagine, and I'm going to speak for you, that the worst thing that can happen is that revenue doesn't come in like you anticipate, and then we're forced into mid-year cuts.
Yeah.
So that's why he stays up at night.
We will budget payroll with these revenue forecasts and distributions to schools and hospitals and reimbursements for healthcare. Some of these expenses we really can't get out of very easily. So you want a revenue forecast that you can reasonably meet. I would prefer really to underestimate a little bit every year, every time, as opposed to overestimate. If you underestimate, you still get the money, and we have procedures for what we can do with that. You just don't want to, grossly underestimate, of course.
Right.
But if you overestimate and you're in the middle of the year, or a couple of times during the year, you're making dramatic changes to your budget and your planning as you're going, and you don't really have a lot of time to do it. We just start slashing across the board. And it's very disruptive to the flow of governmental services that people depend on, and school districts depend on, and health systems depend on it. So yeah, I want to make the forecasts, and I get worried about things that, put it at risk. The next slide here is Julie's favorite slide, is the history of the state's tax revenue. The blue line is what I would call total tax at the REC level. And then there's a general fund line where we take a bunch of we slice various dollars off of the total tax and dedicate it away. That leaves us with general fund direct money, which is what we focus on a lot in the budget when we have to actually start cutting things or adjusting during the mid-year or adjusting in the session. It's the general fund line that becomes very important to people. So this slide shows just a lot of the story of Louisiana's economy and revenue picture since I started here in fiscal year 90, and I run through 15 years to fiscal year 06. Pretty, relatively stable growth path, 4.7% annual total growth, 3.9% a year general fund growth. And then, of course, the storms, Katrina, Rita hit us, and we end up with this giant run-up of revenue as people basically trying to rebuild South Louisiana. Private savings, insurance money, federal government poured money in, and we peaked out in fiscal year 08 in terms of state revenue collections. And by that time, shortly after that, the U.S. economy was going into the Great Recession. The post-Katrina Rita rebuild was slowing down. As the economy weakens, of course, people get a little bit more cautious about anything they're doing. The U.S. Great Recession catches us. Energy price drops. You remember in the summer of 2008, we were running up 120 to 100. We got to almost $150 a barrel oil price. And then it fell off. And, it lost in 5 months what it gained in 5 years. And so oil prices just dropped. And then, of course, we began cutting taxes. We had we didn't know what to do with the revenue coming in. We started repealing in 2 phases. For the most part, the Stelly income tax component of the Stelly plan, which started back in the beginning of 2000. And then lots of other, in the post-storm period, lots of additional tax credits and et cetera passed in. But the trough year was at fiscal year 10. Everything sort of hit, in terms of a revenue hit there. And we began to climb out, but you can see fast and then slower and then slower and then slower. until we had another mini recession in fiscal year 15-16. That's when the oil prices fell off again, and we went into our own little recession. And we had to, John Bell administration came in, and in the last quarter of his first year, he was having to add the fifth penny and increase. We actually increased alcohol and beer taxes. We haven't changed those taxes since 1948, and we did them then. Tobacco and a variety of other things. Credit, all those credit shaves and reductions to exemption and credit programs began in 2015, actually, but extended on into 16. And so we raised revenue until then we finally gave up. The fifth penny expired. We argued over how much to renew, and we renewed, 0.45 cents of that. So revenue have fallen off. And then fiscal year 20 is at the tail end of that is when COVID hit us. So 20 got worse, and then we're down into 21, and there's the forecast horizon is FY21 forward. We're in FY21 now, we're like roughly halfway through it, right? So that's still a forecast number. The blue and the red lines are the forecasts that were made for those fiscal years back in May of 2020. And we haven't changed those until just yesterday. And I've been imposed the changes on both of those revenue concepts. That would be the green squares and the sort of gray triangles. We raised the current year. Things have done, we came down really hard on the forecast in the current year, and federal support has really helped us, and we came down too much. We're going to end up collecting more than we thought back in May. We've adjusted that up, but we've gotten more cautious about fiscal year 22 and 23 and the recovery. I don't want to, if we came down real hard, maybe we bounce back up too much. However, I don't want to dismiss the fact that it's not impossible to have a rapid climb out of here. Like we said before, we got a little nervous. We're trying to be cautious, and we can always add money back at later RECs. And we slowed the growth and the climb out like I said, yesterday's meeting. And the groundwork was laid in the meeting for meeting again in a couple of months, 2 months, 3 months, and we always meet during the session to get that last look at it and for final appropriations. And we know we'll be able to, come back and we hope we're adding money back at a later point when it's time to actually do appropriations.
Yeah,
that was kind of that story there. But
so I wanted to, just kind of before we get into Chris's angle, which is going to be trying to set the budget and what we're going to spend this lessened amount of money on. One of the things, if you're not looking and you're just listening to this as a podcast, when you look at this slide, what you see for fiscal years 1990 through 2005 is a fairly stable revenue picture. Right. There's little jogs up and down, but nothing as overwhelming as what you see after Hurricane Katrina, or even after we dip with the oil crash in 15 and the recovery, and then enacting the extra penny and the extra penny falling off, and then going with the 0.45 pennies. These are all very wide shifts. Yeah. But those 15 years, when you sort of draw a line through those years, and then you draw that straight line out into the future, one of the things that it makes you wonder, because that's sort of like, it sort of draws a line to what if everything just kept inflating with inflation, what spending might look like now. Well, and yeah. Is that wrong or right?
No, I would say that spending, at least from these revenue sources, total tax and total general fund, which is a subset of total tax. So look at the blue line, really. Spending would look like that. Yeah. It can't look any different than that. We have to run balanced budgets. So if in any given year I've got total tax of 10 billion, that's it.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to figure out is if you draw a line through that relatively stable time, and then you continue that line out into the future. Right now, our spending and our revenues are underneath. They're below.
Oh yeah, we permanently reduced our tax base.
Right.
After Katrina, and particularly with the, we would have, if we hadn't done that, we would have very likely returned to these pre-storm paths. These two lines are pre-storm paths. Right. And there was no reason why we would have done anything other than ultimately return to that path and look a lot like FY90 to FY05 in that post FY08, 09 period, in recession period. Because even in that 15 years before, there are recessions. The business cycle is still going on. And that's what it amounted to for us. Katrina, of course, was unbelievably gigantic. Katrina Rita events were just unbelievably gigantic.
Well, and the tax changes that were made at that time. Yeah. What I like to explain to people, because so many people, there's a lot of misinformation out there that our spending is so wildly out of control now as opposed to in our past, or that some anomaly has happened to make it higher. But I like to show people this graph to help them to understand that after this anomaly happened after Katrina, and we got rid of part of our revenue base in a lot of different ways, that once we crashed below the normal revenue and spending, we've never gotten back up to those earlier numbers. So in essence, what you see here is that our government has shrunk. And for so many people out there that want to see that, I kind of want to let them know that that actually is a reality, that it hasn't, that we have actually shrunk government, right. In that perspective. And the constant uptick of that line is inflation. I mean, you can look at running your own household and know that you can't run your household in 2021 on what you ran it in 1990.
Yeah, these numbers are going to go up every year if we do nothing because of inflation, if nothing else.
Right.
And I will point you, Julie, to our website. I've got a couple of pieces on there that talk about the size of state government as economists would look at it, as a share of the economy. And Louisiana's spending as a share of the economy is extremely stable over a 20-year long horizon. We're actually right at the norm for the states overall. I've got a piece that looks at all 50 states and a piece that looks at just Louisiana. And where you see higher growth or more spending, it's in federally funded healthcare for all practical purposes. It's the federal contribution to Louisiana. The state effort, which is this top blue line, plus other fees and self-generated revenue that's not counted in there, is constrained by, we extract from the economy, we can only spend what we extract. So unless you were continuously or constantly increasing your tax rates and bases year after year after year, you can't spend faster than you can't grow your spending faster than your economy's growing. And the fact is, we don't raise taxes or expand tax bases year after year after year after year after year. We don't do it. Of course we don't. It's a political decision. It's hard to do. And when we raise taxes, it's because the legislature ultimately became convinced they absolutely had to.
Well, it gets desperate.
That's the fifth penny decision.
Right. And that's what I see, is that nobody in Baton Rouge wants to raise taxes.
No, of course not.
So much fallout. But I think, there is some misperception out there, and I do like to clear that out, that, if your taxes, if something happens where your taxes get raised like they did in 16 and, really in 16 and then continued in a couple of years later, it's because times are desperate.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, Greg, I really appreciate this, helpful information about Louisiana's revenue picture. And now I'd like to kind of turn over to Chris and see. Right.
I'm gonna stop my share.
And,
Chris can jump in here.
Yep. And how does Louisiana spend what it has and not spend what it doesn't have, which is sort of our situation at the moment. He's bringing up his slide right now, but that slide, while he's bringing up that slide that Greg just had on, if you're listening by podcast, it is a really interesting one to look at. And when you understand the political context and, Katrina and the brand new legislature after term limits for the first time, it's really an interesting story to see all in one graph. All right.
Julie, I'll email you this slide set and that slide so you've got it if you want to just pin it. You can give it to anybody you want. I mean.
Oh, cool. Yeah, maybe we can put it as a link so that if you watch the podcast, you can peek at it without having to go through the whole video cast. If that's a thing that we can do, I'll find out. All right, Chris, show us what you've got.
All right. Well, that was a long discussion on revenues. As you said, Julie, the Louisiana Constitution says we have to have a balanced budget. You can't spend what you don't have. So that's the first order of business always, is for the conference to adopt official forecast. And the pandemic really had a bigger impact on the state general fund revenues than it did on the budget side, because we were able to use CARES dollars. As Greg said earlier, the fiscal year 20 budget was reduced in revenue by about $100 million, and 21 was reduced by about $800 million. We got $1.8 billion of federal CARES dollars, and we were able to use that on coronavirus-related expenses to kind of shore up the current year's budget. And as Greg showed you, we have the current year's budget's okay. We typically look at 3 years when we look at the budget. We look at last year, the current year, and next year. And last year in fiscal year 20, we ended fiscal year 20 with a surplus. For the current year and for next year, we're just trying to maintain status quo. And that's why we were able to do that by using CARES dollars. We ended fiscal year 20 with a $247 million surplus. And it's largely due to the return of gaming revenues. At the time, I think Greg mentioned that the time the Revenue Estimating Conference did the forecast, gaming was pretty much shut down. And so we went into, I guess, March, May with gaming shut down. Well, it ended up coming back. That came back. We had higher returns in corporate and individual income. So we ended the year with a surplus. The Constitution limits that surplus to 6 things that you can do. At least 25% of that surplus has to be put into the rainy day fund. At least 10% of that has to go to pay the unfunded accrued liability of the retirement systems. And then the rest of it can be used for either those 2 things, or to defease debt, used for capital outlay. You can use it for transportation where there's federal matching dollars, and also coastal protection fund. So those are the constitutional uses of that surplus. For the current year, as Greg showed and yesterday the Revenue Estimating Conference adopted, we're going to be okay with the current year unless something bad happens. But I think we're going to be okay with the current year. They're projecting more money that's currently in the forecast. So we shouldn't have to make any budget cuts in the current year. So I think
Great.
21.
All right, Chris, is your slideshow supposed to be progressing right now?
No, I'm gonna get to that.
Sure.
And then we typically look at next year. So I'll go to that now. So actual 1920, this was the budget. The existing budget is about $40 billion. This is on paper. Now you can see the general fund was at $9.8 billion. On paper, it's $9.3 billion, but we used some interagency transfers and some dedicated CARES money to shore up the general fund. So the existing budget should be okay. We shouldn't have to make those mid-year cuts that you were discussing that you might have to make if you had over forecasted. For next year, 21-22 is going to be the challenge. Agencies have requested $10.7 billion of state general fund, and we actually had a $229 million downgrade to the forecast. So prior to the Revenue Estimating Conference meeting, the 5-year forecast showed a projected shortfall of about $500 million. So about $500 million or so. I think the commissioner had mentioned they had gotten it down to about $380 million. Yesterday, the forecast met and reduced the revenues by another $229 million. So that $380 million now becomes a projected shortfall of almost $600 million. So that's $600 million to keep the departments functioning at the same level. We call it continuation. To keep them functioning at exactly what they're doing now, they're going to be short about $680 million.
But they've requested more? Have they requested more than that? No.
They've requested about that. Well, they've requested a little bit more than that. So they're going to be short that. And that's based on continuation. A lot of that is replacing the CARES dollars. So there was about $1 billion of one-time CARES dollars, rainy day fund, the use of federal Medicaid match rate money, and we used some lottery proceeds money. So all those dollars that were used in the current fiscal year here to shore up the budget need to either be replaced or cut. So the commissioner's working with the state departments, the agencies right now, having meetings, saying, where can you cut your budget? What can you give up? So that's kind of what they're doing. They thought they were going to have to cut about $380 million. After yesterday, add another $229 million to that. So they're up to about $600 or so million that they're going to have to reduce as the governor presents the executive budget, because the budget has to be balanced to what the revenue estimating conference said.
And so for those of you that heard our podcast a few weeks ago with Commissioner Jay Darden, that's who we're referring to as the commissioner that's working on all of the individual agency budgets around the state. And they were working with a need that was 229, that would be funded by an additional $229 million that just kind of went away yesterday.
That's correct.
Revenue outlooks aren't as strong as they were. So, our guest that we had just a few weeks ago, his life just got a little bit harder as of yesterday.
Well, the conference, there were two estimates, and the Division of Administration's estimate would be down $35 million. And the Legislative Fiscal Office, which was ultimately adopted, was $229 million lower. Now, Greg says there's some upside. There's some optimism, as he talked about. The federal government could come in with another stimulus package. They just did in December for certain sectors. Nothing to replace revenue loss, but that's certainly on the table with this new federal administration. So that could be something that the states could look towards. This is a slide picture of the existing operating budget, and you can see in the bottom right it's about $40.4 billion. Most of your money, of course, is in the Department of Health. It's at $17.8 billion, and in federal funds, that's about $12.8 billion. In general fund, which Greg was talking about, our state general fund, this is where your taxes are, your income taxes, your sales taxes. You can see most of it is spent in elementary and secondary education, $3.7 billion. The Department of Health at $2.3 billion, and higher education at roughly $1 billion. So those are your three big users of your tax dollars. Some agencies you can see 7 or so, Treasurer, Public Service Commission, Revenue, Environmental Quality, Wildlife and Fisheries, do not use any state general fund. They rely on fees and dedicated funds. You can see when you're talking about where are your state tax dollars spent, this is where they're spent. Last year, we spent $9.8 billion in the state general fund. You can see the blue share of the pie. K-12 education spent $3.8 billion. About 40% of your tax dollars are spent in elementary education. The next biggest user is healthcare at $2.3 billion. That's 24%. Higher education, roughly $1 billion and 11%. And then, and by the way, 18 years ago, this was about 16% we used to spend on higher education. But when you started talking about post-Katrina and the fall, that fall down to revenue, not up to that line, higher education absorbed a lot of that. And they basically did it through tuition increases on the students. And then you can see your other shares of where your state tax dollars are spent. About 7% on public safety and corrections, and on, about 9% on general government. Speaking of state general fund, this is your state general fund expenditures, and it mirrors exactly what Greg talked about in revenues. I go back to prior to the storms in fiscal year 04, we were spending about $6.5 billion. Today, we're at 9.8 billion. And so that's about a $3.3 billion increase over that time. And as Greg said, that's about a 3% increase, average increase over those years. That 3.3 billion, this is who got the money. The Department of Health got about 1.5 billion of that. That's about 46%. Elementary and secondary education, 1.2 billion of that. That's 38%. And those two combined were 84%. Higher education, they're roughly where they were 18 years ago. Less than 1% growth in higher education in state tax dollars. And then your other areas of state government grew by about 15% at $500 million.
Yeah.
So that just is a quick look at the budget, where we spend our money, where we spend the tax dollars that y'all were talking about in the revenues. And going forward, next year, 2022, it's going to be a challenge. I know the governor has to present a balanced budget. The revenue estimating conference will probably come back, as they usually do, sometime during session after a few months, to see what's happened at the federal level, see if that line Greg was showing you that's going up slightly is going to step up a little bit more in terms of jobs and economic recovery, and see what that'll do to the revenue picture. And then there may be some adjustments to the budget in fiscal year 22. Absent some federal recovery, it's going to be some pretty significant cuts across the board and really in elementary education and in healthcare. Those are kind of mandated. Elementary education is funded through the minimum foundation program. They're kind of locked into what they're spending now in terms of next year. If we don't adopt a new formula for elementary and secondary education, it goes back to the prior formula. Healthcare, you see, we're spending a lot of our general fund on healthcare. If you have a Medicaid program, you have to provide certain levels of service. You have to have access to care. Also in healthcare, for every dollar you spend, you get a federal match of $2, $2 to $3. So when you cut a dollar of healthcare, you're really cutting $3 to $4 of total budget. And so I showed you earlier, these are the three bigs: Department of Health, elementary, and higher education. So when you're talking about discretionary general fund dollars, if you go back to this slide, you can look and see if you have to cut $600 million, you can eliminate all of these. You're not going to get to 600. You're not going to balance the budget on culture, recreation, and tourism. You're not going to balance 600 million there. You're not going to balance it on the Secretary of State or Department of Civil Service. $600 million is pretty significant. And you've got really, and correction services, short of, we've already had justice reform where we released low-level offenders. So really your correction services are locked in right there. So you're really looking at really kind of two areas of state government, the Department of Health and higher education, to take care of $600 million. So that's why I kind of showed you this slide.
Right.
But those are all the slides I have.
And people, I went ahead, Chris, and if we could go to that slide that I took the state general fund in 2004, which was, you said, $6,537,000,000, and inflation adjusted it on my little data.bureau of labor statistics.gov, BLS.gov, and it inflates to $9,193,000,000, and it's at 9.8 billion instead. So it's 9.2 versus 9.8. So people, first of all, I think it's easy not to realize that from 2004 through 2021, that inflation alone accounts for the vast majority of the increase from the spending levels, over those years. But, one of the things that I've always tried to rationalize, like that last 0.6 or that last $600 million, I think a lot of that probably picks up as the two highest costs or the two highest proportions of our budget are healthcare and education. And the inflation rate used in healthcare expenses is much greater than the inflation rate that's used generally by an economist, right, Greg? Is that true?
Right. Yeah, your healthcare expenditures do typically grow faster than just typical headline consumer inflation. I mean, that's been observed for many years.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's one of the ways that I've always had to try to look at it, as to why the increase is greater than just inflation might have allowed for. And for those of you that are listening or watching, and just trying to understand, the business of the state is that it is mandated to take care and manage the Medicaid system for the residents of our state. So this massive amount of money comes into the state every year from the federal government and is managed by our state to provide those Medicaid services or the healthcare services to our state. And like Chris said, for every dollar that we cut out of our healthcare spending as a state, out of our state general fund portion, we lose, would you say, Chris, was it $2 or
$3 of federal funding?
Yeah. So every cut that you make, is so much greater. And it doesn't just it impacts our residents, it impacts our hospitals, it impacts all of our healthcare establishments. It's a lot to balance. And, a lot of times when I know being a legislator, when people would say, well, why are the same areas cut all the time? And it's healthcare, higher ed, because you really can't cut K through 12 education because it's subject to its formulas in the Constitution. So why do you cut healthcare and higher ed? Because, that's basically, I remember it being about 80% of what you can cut. Because everything else is small dollars, like Chris had mentioned. So,
and that really is that 3-to-1 match. If you're still looking at this screen, that 2.3 billion plus the fees plus this, all that combined is what almost $4 billion, and we're getting almost 13.
Yeah.
So we're getting $3 of federal money for our state effort.
Right.
Combined. So that's why when I say when you cut those dollars, you're cutting. Remember, Medicaid expansion is a 90-10 match. So for every dollar we put up, we're getting $9 from the federal government. They're paying for 90% on the Medicaid expansion population. So we do have a pretty significant match rate. And when Greg was talking about you want to kind of err on the low side, if you overestimate revenues by $200 to $300 million, and they don't, and you go back in December and redo that forecast, and you're $200 to $300 million short, now you're half a year gone, and that $200 to $300 million becomes a $600 million problem that you have to cut, because a lot of the money in regular, not in healthcare, but in regular forms of state government is in personnel services, which means you have to lay somebody off. So that $300 million cut becomes a $600 million cut. And you can see, you can't cut $600 million out of these. It's just impossible. That it's math. It doesn't work. So it's right here in healthcare and here in higher education where the money is, and that's where the cuts. And people also talk about dedicated funds. Well, if we undedicated these funds, but these dedicated funds have a constituency. The legislature voted to dedicate these funds.
Right.
So, well, besides that, those dedicated funds are all funding some operations, some activity. And okay, undedicate the fund, you still got to figure out how you're going to fund what those departments are doing with that particular means of finance. You don't get rid of the expenditures.
Right.
You still have to deal with them.
To that point, so look at wildlife and fisheries. They're dedicated funds of $102 million. Okay, that's your conservation fund. That's the money that people pay in their hunting and fishing licenses to go hunt and fish, which a lot of that is going to pay wildlife agents to manage the hunting and fishing. If you undedicate this, people are not going to pay a hunting and fishing license so you can go use it in the Department of Health. You're still going to have to pay a hunting and fishing license to use it here. Same thing with the Department of Environmental Quality. They have money that's dedicated here in the Department of Environmental Quality, which business and industry pays a permit fee so that they can be regulated. Business and industry is not going to pay a permit fee that's not dedicated so you can go use it for agriculture and forestry or the Attorney General's office. So that's why those funds are dedicated. Greg's right. Even if you undedicate them, you still have to do those services. And these are specific fees that have been statutorily dedicated. Most of these are fees. Most of these are not general fund that's been dedicated to this. It's a fee that's been dedicated specifically for that purpose.
Exactly. So, and part of why we like to dispel a lot of like the rhetoric. And I know that when you listen to the state budget, and you look at this spreadsheet that's on the screen right now, it kind of feels like drinking from the fire hose. And it sort of is. It's a lot of information and there's a lot of nuance and it's complicated. And, that makes for things that are really easy to spin. And these two guys I rely on for a no spin zone, and it's the kind of place where you can go to really have understanding of it. And I thank you guys for being here today and bringing the fire hose of information. So there's plenty more that you can get if you Google their respective their website at the Louisiana Legislative Fiscal Office, and you can actually also Google the House Fiscal Division and find a lot of information on the state's finances. And really research the what's going on in our state and what the actual spending levels and revenue levels look like. We're going into a fiscal session this year, and the reason why this is important, especially this year, is because it's the first fiscal session of a legislative term, which means that there's more likelihood, more possibility of really meaningful tax legislation being done in this session than there will be like in the last fiscal session of their term, which is an election year. Some of the things that we talked about today are some of the reasons why it will be difficult to do a lot of the kind of reform that involves dollars. People talk about wanting to get rid of individual income tax or wanting to get rid of franchise tax or any other, kind of tax. And when you look at the situation that our state is in already, it really drives home how complicated that will be, when we try to unravel that. But I want to thank both of you for being here today. It's about all the time we have. But thank you to Greg Albrecht and Chris Keaton, two guys that just provide so much information for our state and so valuable. We really appreciate you guys. For those of you that are listening or watching, we hope that you'll be able to join us for our virtual annual conference. It'll be taking place over 3 days, but presented as one event. On January 28th, we will be presenting on the state budget, and that will include the revenue side and potential tax reform, along with more information and the ability to interact with our guests and ask them questions. On February 5th, we'll be handling workforce and the economy. And then finally, on February 11th, we'll be dealing with infrastructure. We'll be joined by all of our Videocast guests. And if you are interested in attending, visit our website for more details. You can register for the event there. It's www.elevatela.org. That's Elevate with 2 L's, or ELLEVATELA.org. For those of you who are listening, if you're interested in joining Elevate, you can also visit that website, and you can also find a link there to watch all of our interviews. And you can also listen to all of our interviews everywhere that you find your podcasts by looking up Elevate's Engage podcasts. And finally, don't forget to share this videocast or podcast with your social network if you found it interesting. I'm your host, Julie Stokes, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.